Thank you once again, Dia. I must tell you, it's a deeply unnerving moment to be the only one without a jacket among at least the men on stage, and I'm not used to this. But I will take it from there. You heard a little bit of the context, and I think we're looking forward to all your perspectives. Sadhana, maybe we start with you. I'm going to break this conversation up into 4 parts. I think the first is what really is the starting point and baseline of India's R&D ecosystem. What can we really learn from China? We'll come back to that, and then let's imagine a little bit the path forward. But maybe start us off with, as a person who's seen the R&D ecosystem at such proximity, what's your view on where we are and what's really the baseline?
So thanks Satyan. Thanks for putting me up first. Interesting question. And I've been in the industry for about 25 odd years, so I've actually seen India evolve from an R&D ecosystem perspective. While we talk a lot about India's move to innovation-based ecosystem now and today, but I would actually tend to think that through the 1990s and 2000s, is when the Indian companies actually started their innovation journey. So it's not just now in the 2020s that we see it, but even earlier. And you'll remember a lot of companies trying to get into that innovation journey. Not only, 3 major differences that I would tend to think I saw at that time compared to where we are today. Number 1 is the fact that all these companies at that time looked at multinationals, so looked at the Pfizers, the Mercks, and kept them as their role models, which meant that they invested heavily, created huge infrastructure, paid top dollar for the talent. So let's keep that when we come to today's ecosystem in our mind. The other one that I've noticed, which is different from today, is the fact that the startup, forget the ecosystem, but even the startups was in a very nascent stage or probably non-existent at that time. And the third observation for me when I look back in time is the fact that the CDMO space, which is again very critical from an ecosystem perspective, was not mature at all. And each of these has a bearing when we look at today's health of R&D ecosystem. It's easy to say R&D, but I'm actually going to split it into the R and the D piece because the two are in a totally different journey or path right now. So let's start with development because that's where clinical development, which is what India started off establishing itself in. For those of you who are not very much into R&D, when you talk about development, and I'm using this for clinical development, there is the late phase development, which is, let's say, primarily phase 3 studies, huge number of patients, comparative assessments, and that's the data that you're primarily using for regulatory filings across the world. And then you have the early phase work, which is first in human studies, then in a small cohort of patients, which is phase 2 studies. India's been in the journey of late phase development since a very long time. So if I look today, I see a very mature ecosystem, whether it's sponsors, whether it's investigators and sites and physicians who are our investigators. Even the regulatory ecosystem is fairly well developed. The regulators know how to evaluate applications, how to approve studies, how to look at the safety and efficacy of earlier phase data. So very well established ecosystem, including service providers, CROs being the primary ones. Come to early phase work, which is essentially phase 1 and phase 2A up to the proof of concept. I don't think we are there right now. There is a move by the government to establish 4 phase 1 centers, develop them to a level of maturity. But I always believe that you can train people to an extent, but what you need then is experiential learning. And if you don't do much of phase 1 work in this country, then the learnings through experience never come to you. So today, if you ask me, we don't have too much or too well-developed capacity as far as clinical, conducting clinical research, designing studies, reviewing the data, because don't forget, when you're doing a phase 1 study, the only data that an ethics committee has, the only data that a regulator has is essentially preclinical data. Has data from labs, data from animals, and based on that, you have to make your efficacy safety assessments for a particular molecule. And that is not yet in any stage of maturity at this point in time. Come to discovery, which is the R piece. Two points before I go into the India ecosystem. The first data point, and I think you did allude, or somebody alluded to that in the beginning, is the fact that while you will see large companies marketing, commercializing biotech products, but the source of these molecules, biologics, very often is small biotech companies across the world. And number two is many of those are actually acquired from the academia as part of university projects. So when you talk about the feeder system for discovery ecosystem, you have to ensure that your academia and the startup piece is very well established and developed. If I look at the startups today, I'm incredibly proud. I mean, we have the pleasure of having Curadev represented here, but it's not just that. Immunal Therapeutics, ImmunoAct, Immune, which is in the dermatology segment, Sekai, which is more in diabetes, talk about Bugworks, which is in the antimicrobial space. So we are now covering a large number of therapeutic areas, although many are focused more on immunology and oncology for obvious reasons. So incredibly proud of where we are today from where we started just a couple of years ago. When it comes to academia, that's a big question mark in my mind, and we can talk about it later. But you have the premier institutes, the IITs, IISc, IIMs, BITS, where you get your best talent from. You have some established incubation system. But if you leave that aside, that's just, to me, pockets of excellence. The rest of the country really lacks that infrastructure. It's not deep science at all, no, barring a few exceptions again. But to me, the fundamental problem is our education policy. And if you see the university education system, where is the incentive, where is the impetus for getting into translational work, translational research? Today, I mean, I'm a physician, and when I did my medicine, did I learn about basic research at all? When I meet with my global counterparts, cutting across any company, what I notice is for them to progress, what has helped them is to have the medical degree and have a PhD in some therapy area, whatever it is. So my understanding of basic research obviously is then going to be less than somebody who's also worked in basic research while pursuing medicine. On the other hand, you flip it to scientists. How much do they understand about drug development? How much do they understand about really what a patient needs, what the unmet medical need is? So I think that's one of the reasons you don't really see academic spin-offs from India at all. You do see some pieces of the ecosystem from a startup perspective, some incubators, some bit of, I mean, CCamp is a great example of what's happening today. Come to then Indian pharmaceutical companies, and I'm seeing, and that's why now I'll link it to what I started off with. You see the way companies are approaching innovation today. It's way different from the way they approached it in the 1990s and 2000. They're willing to work on a, what should I say, lean ship model, but then make use of the external CDMO space, partner with the ecosystem, and also look at the fact that you have advisors, consultants available to take instead of trying to build everything themselves. And that's a huge difference that I see here. From a regulatory perspective, huge investment by DBT. I mean, if you compare it to China, it's going to seem insignificant, but I think huge change. DBT, BIRAC as part of the DBT arm, different types of funds, whether it's a seed fund, it's a deep fund or a leap fund. There are initiatives to help enable the startup ecosystem. I'm going to stop here because what I've not covered is the funding piece, but I'm sure that will come up during our discussion.
No, thank you, sir. And I'm also going to put a plug on one point here, which is we don't necessarily need to be everything from R to D. Is there also an opportunity to let R be done somewhere else and then we do D in India? But we'll come back to that when we go to the... Robert, maybe coming to you for the same question. Outside in, sitting outside India, when you... To you, Robert, as an investor who's looked at different geographies, would you concur with that assessment of where India's starting point is as of 2025 on the baseline?
Yeah, so mostly, but not entirely. So, and maybe I think these observations come from, I've been coming to India now for about 20 years, China for about 20 years also, and Japan, which might be an interesting counterpart to both, for about 15 years. So I think, by the way, there's a simple answer to whether is India ready for the biotech frontier, because India's already on the biotech frontier, so I don't think you have to worry about that. I'm not sure it's ready to break out. In fact, I'm positive it's not ready to break out in the same way, say, China has, and we can talk about some of the reasons why that's true. I think the most fundamental difference, and I think you were alluding to it a little, and I would say the discussion about the first billion-dollar molecule was, I think, right on point of what the problem is. What transformed China was actually the decision that they wanted to have and were willing to pay for biotech-like molecules in the country. It wasn't about how we export to innovation to the US. It wasn't about anything but how do we build for our patients more innovative medicines locally. And that was a commitment that drove lots of things over a long period of time. But there are very few places that have an innovative biotech industry without having high-priced drugs. I mean, again, I don't think high-priced drugs aren't a good. I mean, arguably they're a bad. But I think there's a very, very strong correlation. And I think if you look, as an example, at Japan, Japan has, an incredibly advanced academic situation. It has some of the best medical research in the world, and it has almost no biotech. And in part, drugs are very low priced in Japan. So again, there's at least a correlation there. So, a problem in India is it's certainly not, it's not the smarts of the academics or the people who are here, although you need more. But I think that the ability to create an ecosystem that translates drugs for India, I think, is what probably holds it back more than anything else, the lack of that market or the slow advancements of that market.
Sorry, could you just help us define the word ecosystem? What is an ecosystem for India?
Well, so I guess an ecosystem involves having a broad enough number of innovators, funders, consumers, and the virtuous cycle that comes from successes in each one of those. And it obviously, I mean, there is tremendous pharmaceutical manufacturing in India, and now there's been growing tremendous biologics manufacturing. I mean, all the capabilities are there. We can talk about whether there's adequate risk-taking and risk-taking capital and who's willing to do that work and who's willing to fund that work. A lot of the China innovation that you were talking about, that didn't come from what I would call a traditional biotech investor, right? That came from cycling money through other sectors and people who made money in real estate or made money in other industries, cycling into biotech, and the absence, the depression that came after, that actually I think is actually more cause for why China now has so much of the outsourcing molecules. It's actually because that funding dried up, so money has to come from somewhere, and so it comes from outsourcing their molecules. They could make more money if there was still the money within China to do it. So, but I think those are all the pieces that are needed for that.
Thank you. I wanted to now come, Dr. Arjun, to you. For someone who is now actually on the ground of this baseline that is India's talent, your own assessment of both the ecosystem, but what's actually needed to succeed the way you have, and what will it take to actually succeed even larger as we define this a little better?
Thank you. I think I'll just start back with your graph, where you started the 60s, 70s, in the post-generic phase. Because I came back to India in 1999. I had worked at SmithKline Beecham and came back, just started drug discovery in early phase there. And came back to India because we signed the patent laws and we become compliant to do drug discovery, actually. And in 18 months, I bounced out of the company, as did many, many people, because it was just junk, complete. The problem was that we had absolutely no understanding of what we wanted to do. We had the idea that we were going to do it without any sense of how to do it. You wanted to do something without the ecosystem you're talking about. So I had a stark choice at that point, but I had an opportunity to join a US-based investor who was starting biotech services, which was really nothing I was interested in at all when I started. But it became the wisest choice I made, because in 6 years we've created a biotech service company which services Pfizer, services Roche, and on their dime we train people. Okay? 6, 7 years through that process, we started to do more complex things. We started to say, okay, give us a target and we'll find a drug for you. Okay, and so that started to happen. And then after a while, that gave me a sense that if the partner is recruiting, I think Sadhana is right in terms of the people, the traditional thing. We have a problem sometimes with being very hierarchical, and that doesn't stick very well with innovation. Yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir does not really work in innovation. Okay? So you have to have people who are ready to challenge you as a leader of your group, right? And that's something that takes very careful recruiting. There are people in India who can do it, and I think what we have shown is that it can be done. Now, when I joined, when I did that, one of the things was we were getting, one of the worst parts about the drug, the service industry is the guy who's paying for your results wants the best people on his work, and the best people get bored doing what they're told to do. It's kind of a very difficult cycle. You recruit people with real energy, they get bored in a little while. And the idea of doing drug discovery was always in my head, and so even though we weren't prepared, even though 2008 had just happened, and 2010 was happening, and you could invest in a house, and it would be 3x in like 2 years or 3 years, and so who the hell is going to invest in biotech, right, if you can do that, where you don't even know if you're going to get your money back. So it was more kind of thing where it was done stupidly, I guess, so I wouldn't say there's a path to follow. But I was also energized a lot by the people I'd worked with. I saw enormous energy here that I didn't see in the US, actually. I saw tiredness. Okay? I trained there for several years, and I think that there is an energy, if you get the right people here, that you can actually tap into and do a lot. And of course, the ecosystem part, which is a big deal as well, government and so on. Fast forward, I don't want to talk about what we did there. I mean, we picked targets, we decided to do it on ourselves. We decided to do the hardest things, not the easiest things. I said first in class, nothing where there's anything in the clinic. Nothing where somebody's else already shown you that it works. Right? You got to pick the hardest problems, and if you can succeed there, then that's good, because it also makes business sense in a way, because the hardest problems have a lot of elbow room, you have time. Nobody's already focused on that problem. Whereas if I say you want the next PD1, there are 800 companies doing that, right? So the thing is that it depends on how you pick your problem. I think we picked in that direction. But a lot of what they're saying around the infrastructure missing is a problem if you want to do many such companies. It's not so easy. The money wasn't there. And I think geopolitics in the last few years, and in fact, I would say the last 3 months, okay, has changed so severely that it has actually altered government attention in this country, because one of the things we have talked about is innovation in this country without money. I've sat in biotech company, where we've, the forums of some of the big biotech investing entities of India, where the idea of money doesn't, they say, here's Israel, look what they've done, but Israel had $5 billion to do it. What have you given us? Right? So nothing. And so that part is now starting to hit them, that we didn't really spend the money on the innovation space. And as you said, it is there. The last part of your curve was the innovation space. I believe this geopolitical thrust is genuine. I sense it. Institutes of eminence are being picked to push in this direction. And I am positive that, I'm optimistic, let me put it this way, that there's going to be change. There are people here who are really, really smart. And I don't see that why we can't do anything that anybody else can't do, has done. Okay? So even the R part, and so that's to your point, should we leave R to somebody else? No, we should do it. We should completely do it.
And maybe just to understand that better, so as you look at it in 2025, and if you take the definition that Robert had for us on ecosystem, on, let's take R&D, right? On talent, on funding, on infrastructure, on waking up, being able to give an assay to someone else to get it done if you have the idea, for example. If you were to give us a number, 3 on 5, 5 on 7, 5 on 10, 7 on 10, where do you think we are on readiness to actually embark on the adventure that you think?
So that's a good question, but I think I can try to dodge kind of the answer a little bit. What I would say is that you don't innovate in groups of 10,000. Okay, you innovate in smaller groups. So you may not need enormous abilities and infrastructure of scale to do it. Okay, so that is one thing, right? So innovation in and of itself is not, it's small teams always, right? So if you create sort of these, if you seed these through very good institutional academic centers, given volume, you might be able to do it. One of the persons in the earlier thing said, to retain talent in India and not let them go out, create things where people don't go out. It's happening, more people are getting retained in India now, but probably even more is required to keep people in. I think there's a lot of things that can be done for that.
Can I make a comment? So, Arjun in many ways is a one of a kind. So I mean, I think there are companies that do brand new first in man. Like, here's a target. I'm really excited about it. I don't care that there's not other clinical evidence yet. I think the revolution in China didn't come from first in kind. It came in the second, third, fourth, and fifth molecule in an area, and that was driven, I think, by something that does have to change in India if you want to be there. And you mentioned it. It's you have to be able to do phase 1 trials here. I mean, I think the optimization in man that they've been able to do in China, and it's almost the Wild West if you think about how quickly, whether it's bispecific antibodies, whether it's drug antibody conjugates, that work has accelerated so quickly in China. Access to capital is a very, very important part, but access to patients who are willing to be part of those trials is as important.
I just agree with that completely. The regulatory part in India, even preclinically, I think there are lots of spaces that animals, for example, large animal research.
Yeah.
Right. We had to do all of our large animal work in Canada, okay, so which cost a lot of money. There's this gaps and clinical trial, phase 1, phase 2, and I think Sadhana said it perfectly, it's experiential. Yeah. It's not just that you put up a hospital and you're suddenly a clinical trial phase 1 team. So it's really the greatest doctors in India who got to get involved in it. You got to get the best oncologists or the best clinicians of any kind to actually motivate them into teaching hospital kind of situations, and that's very important.
But actually, you began the segue into, I think, the next part of what we wanted to discuss, which is, we've spoken a lot about the Chinese ecosystem having delivered, just in terms of the numbers. PD-1, PD-L1 obviously is a unique case of how many are coming out of China. But as an observer of not just China, but other geographies as well, are there a few markers, lead indicators, ideas that we need to be borrowing from as this room of startups, investors, and facilitators begins to think about this ecosystem coming together in India?
Well, I mean, I think we mentioned some of them. So, I mean, I do think in infrastructure to how to think and be more sophisticated about early stage clinical trials. So as you translate from research findings to animal studies to first in man. I think it's just that way of thinking is just a critical way of thinking that has to be developed. I think another, and again, I don't know how to incentivize it. I think compared, and Japan has this problem, China does not. Like groups of 10 people who are willing to go really hard and fail after 2 years or 3 years, and then just go on to the next one if that fails, and that one might fail after 3 years. I think that's not necessarily a core, I think, Indian mindset.
Attribute.
Yeah. I think rewarding and incentivizing that, and how to figure out. I have no suggestions, but how to incentivize that, I think, is common in places that have big entrepreneurial ecosystems and hard to develop in ones that don't. I'd say other parts of government contribution are pretty interesting. Japan, I would say, has a pretty interesting model they've been experimenting with. There's a whole program called the AMID program that involves incentivizing investors by making matching capital, at a high multiple, like 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, available in areas that they're interested in. Has, if nothing else, that it's attracted capital. Capital isn't all you need, but it's something you need. And so I think that's been helping too.
Hadna, maybe to you to baseline China for us.
So I won't do baselining, but I'll try and see what we can learn from China, right? Using that baseline. And for me, the key word is learning. It's not copying, because China is at a different state of evolution. To me, the key question that all of us should be answering is, do we want to play the catch-up game, or do we want to leapfrog? Because if we just keep copying what China has done, then we'll always be a few steps behind China. By the time, whatever aspiration we have, 2030, do X, Y, Z, China would have moved several notches higher. So to me, it's all about what's our intent, what's driving us, and then what do we want to do. I'm going to take a bit of a diversion for a second. And as we were speaking on this panel, it just reminded me of, when was it? Maybe Jan 2025, earlier this year, when the small AI startup, DeepSeek, really shook the foundations of Silicon Valley giants as the world looked on in awe. Actually, the same thing's happening in the biotech sector in China. It's just that it's away from this sensational public attention that DeepSeek got. And what's critical is that it hasn't happened overnight. I happened to read a little bit about China a couple of years ago, and what I found absolutely impressive is the fact that their 5-year plan, 2011 to 2015, so we are talking about 15 years ago, that's the first time I saw a shift in strategy from imitation to innovation. I don't know how many of us picked it up at that time. I mean, I read it just a few years ago, but way back in 2010, when the next 5-year plan was released, it talked about moving from imitation to innovation. And China has been at it ever since then, or even before, for that matter. So there are a lot of things we can learn from China. Maybe 2-3 things which mostly get highlighted. One is the engagement of the government, and you alluded to that as well, regulatory reforms and talent, or the investment in talent. So I'll probably touch upon these 3, but there are 2 that I always find very fascinating, and they do not get covered at all, or do not get talked about at all. And to me, that's the involvement of the diaspora and involvement of the big tech or big companies and or conglomerates, and I'll touch upon that. So let me start with the obvious ones. Talk about government. China has this emerging strategic sectors that it identifies, right? And biotech has been consistently featuring in that strategic focus area. And I would say, here is a country which put its money where its mouth was. So the amount of public funding that has gone into R&D, and I'm specifically talking about biotech now, has been enormous. That's been through grants, that's been through tax sobs, that's been through several incentives that the government has given. But it has also gone on to build infrastructure because it realized that just giving money is not going to help if the infrastructure is not there. And it was fascinating to read that we talk about 2000, 1990s, but way back in, I think, the 1980s, it created two types of biotech centers. One were these large biotech bases. The idea was to move things or bring things from ideation to production, way back in 1980s. And the other one was labs which acted as national training centers for young scientists. And these were all housed in the top-notch research institutes in China. So not only young scientists benefited through these training institutes, but it's interesting to see the knock-on effect on the research institutes themselves, because now they got access to the best-in-class infrastructure, best-in-class resources, best-in-class funding that they could get. So the caliber and the standard of the research institutes also went up. So it's a two-way benefit that China saw through that. If you look at the public-private partnership model that China has, I think hats off to that country. And sometimes, well, of course, I mean, I'm very much a pro-democracy person, but sometimes it does help when it's a very centrally drive-down, state-owned machinery, because then you can get things moving in a very, very fast and efficient manner. It's also interesting to see the policy tailwinds that you see in China, because there was a singular focus on making China globally competitive in the biotech space. And then it's all about what policy changes need to be done to make it conducive to be globally competitive. And interestingly for me, and I don't know if you would concur with me, is the cultural piece or the attitudinal piece. So the China of the past didn't like to be pro-capitalistic. Right. But China of today is all pro-entrepreneurship. And pro-entrepreneurship and capitalism don't necessarily go hand in hand, right? So it's all about fail fast and or whatever, pivot fast. So either you fail, or if you're not failing, then pivot. So everything that you read and everything that you see happening in China is about establishing processes, mechanisms to either get rid of the weed or to help pivot to the next stage. So that's from the perspective of government engagement. When I move to regulatory reforms, and I don't want to talk about the IP strengthening, but beyond that, a couple of things that quickly come to my mind is inclusion of innovative medicines in the national reimbursement list. Now, why is that critical? And you said it in the beginning. Is you don't then need to look at US or Europe as your potential commercial opportunities. Just the sheer local market is enough for a startup to take things from ideation to commercialization, because that market is good enough. If you're going to get reimbursed, you don't have to depend on the rest of the world to accept. It then also ensured that the regulatory review and approval mechanisms and processes were expedited for domestic innovative products. Ethics, everything, speak about every component of the review process. And I don't know how many of you have seen this, but China FDA, which is now called NMPA. NMPA actually made an announcement some time back, and that announcement was, it's worth thinking about it. It was to say that any filing with falsified data, okay, would obviously be rejected, but you then go back in your cycle, so it's not as if you then correct that data and send it back. You have to resubmit your application right from the beginning. So if your submission's been in the queue and under review for the last 1 year, you go back in time by 1 year. there was an amnesty period given, and during that time, you could take back your submissions. Of course, the whole intent was to enhance quality, enhance credibility of the data that comes out of China globally, and also reduce the review timelines. But what's noteworthy, and let's not debate about that, but 86% of the files were taken back. Okay, during this amnesty period. As I said, let's not talk about that number because that opens a Pandora's box. But to me, what's important is that that increased the credibility of the data that's coming out later from there. Speaking about talent, you spoke about the 1,000 talent program, Sea Turtle, and all those things that China has done. But here is the data. I mean, we talk about reverse brain drain. I like to call it brain gain. Interesting data points. From 1978 or thereabouts, there are about 6.5 million scientists who've gone abroad, specifically to the US. And guess how many have, to study, guess how many have come back? Any guesses? Sorry? 1 million. Any other guess? 86%, 4.5 million have come back. 4.5 million. China had this state-funded program of sending young scientists to do their PhDs so they'll fund the whole program in the US for these young scientists with an expectation, and you know what the word expectation would mean in China, to come back and establish that scientific discipline within the country. And in the last 20 years or so, they have 12,000 people who've gotten their PhDs from American universities. I think that speaks a lot to then creating that ecosystem. But I want to end with this, my perception on what is significantly different between China and India, and that's the contribution of the diaspora. So we speak a lot about the Indian diaspora, but when you look up what the Chinese diaspora has done, and I'm again referring only to the R&D space, significant number of Silicon Valley founders in the R&D space have actually come back. And they've come back with what? With capital? Because they've been successful entrepreneurs in the US. They've come back with their networks, and they've come back with experience. The government looks at them almost as priority citizens, gives them all the possible SOBs that it can give, and the benefit of that is they then actually start their own startups in China, which then has very easy access to global funds, which has access to the international markets, because that's what they networked with. Compare that to India. It's not that the diaspora doesn't value what India is doing. But if you look at the involvement, how many high-profile R&D guys have actually come back to start ventures in India? They may have come back to join some big industry, but very, very few have come back to India. So they would do financial investments as angels, through VC funds, whatever. But that means there's a financial engagement. There's no hands-on engagement. They're not passing on their experience to the Indian startups. And I think that's something that I find tremendously different between India and China.
Sorry, I want to bring you in on the same question, which is, if there was the benefit of picking up a few things from the international ecosystem on R&D, and whether that's the Cambridge cluster or the Boston cluster or Silicon Valley or China or Israel, all of which have done, or Japan, what is it that would have really helped accelerate that journey that you were on, let's say from the 2008-10 period to now, and that's still relevant now?
I think, first of all, it wouldn't be high profile. Coming back is fine, but it was not high profile. The thing is that overall, two things come to mind, I think. One, and China is a good example because the US system is kind of a very evolutionary system. It's an old university system, old NIH, old NSF. It's a very ancient kind of, almost 70, 80, 100 years. atomic energy, everything's going to come out of that system, right? So I think you have a base, and if you're trying to catch up fast, then it's a different thing you got to think about. And there, the Chinese system is a little different, right? So exactly what she said about the kind of incentivization that was done, the mass scale re-recruitment of people, right? The mass scale increase of funding in academia. I have a lot of academics in my family. The money is ridiculously poor for research. Let's face it, right? We don't spend, we don't get, right? It's very simple, right? And so then to say we don't, it's self-actualizing, failure is a self-actualizing prophecy, then you just keep saying the same thing. It's cyclical and can be broken. I think the government's starting to understand that, at least through the centers that are there. So that is something that, if I had to say one thing, that would be one of the Chinese thing. And experientially, the moment we did our first big deal with Roche, Chinese companies came to recruit us. They said, pick up your entire company and come to China.
Yeah.
I went to China 4 times in 6 months because of the offers. So just bring this here and let's do it. You don't need any diligence, nothing. You've just done this deal, that's enough, that's a diligence, we're done. Okay, and it was like we couldn't speak Chinese. It was very difficult to go there, and it was very hard to sort of think that I could pick the entire group and bring them there. And I didn't do it. But money, land, whatever it was, right? So they would do it through a pharmaceutical company, it was possible. That kind of acceleration which China has, and speaks to the fact that she says, they can change what they want to do very fast, and we have a burden on that. It's not easy for us to do, and so we have to live with what we have. But I think that would be something which would be worth studying, how you can break, at least not get maybe all the way there, but at least somewhere you can get in between where you can accelerate it. Maybe within institutes of eminence, for example, which are really very few in India, but which have the alma mater, the everything around them to pull people back, to pull that through. And there is energy. There are a lot of in the diaspora that there's of course all kinds of people, but there's also an enthusiasm for making something happen really in India. So, and more than biotech, I would say that if I wouldn't look at biotech as a real issue, because I came from a technical college, I came from an IIT. Basically, I'm really surprised that there's so little in the tech space, in electronics, computation. That really strikes me as what the hell. Because when I went to college, I mean, the kids around me were brilliant. Okay, so that was the hardest place to study. I've been elsewhere. That was the hardest place, the undergrad I was in. Right? So that's the gap we've not taken people like that and driven that through. And biotech is kind of esoteric in compared to that, because it's difficult and all that. But that's much more straightforward. And that's not happened as well. I think, again, I say geopolitics is the best driver of a lot of things, and it will drive things in the next few years, hopefully in the right direction, because it has to happen, because you can't be so dependent the way we are, on everything today. And China is not simple.
I'm going to bring us to a close and maybe open it up to the audience, just being cognizant of time. So I'll have one final round of questions. One question for all three of you, that's the same question, is I'm going to borrow from each of you, saying we're in 2025, we can't necessarily catch up, there's potentially a leapfrog opportunity. It's an evolutionary system, you can't evolve 180 years of research into 18 months. Taking all of you, there's a funding ecosystem, they're taking all of that. If we were still, however, to imagine a better version of India's innovation, say 2030, which is 5 years out, just one fast round-robin question, maybe Sadhana, starting with you. What's the one big idea that can begin to coalesce this together, that if this group was to take away and at least give it the weight of their shoulders and voices in making sure it's heard in the right areas, but also concretize this into a message that we can put out? What would be your one big idea? And we just go around the room to get questions on top of that as well.
Difficult one. And not because we are in the 8 roads conference, but I would think if I had to pick one thing, it would be funding. How do we create a deep funding pool where you actually have Indian companies, billionaires, everybody contributing? And then, of course, you can think of a methodology of getting first right of refusal or whatever. But we have reasonably good funds for early stage startups, but the huge, big funding gap exists for the growth phase startups. And that can only be corrected if you have deep pool of
Find
funds.
multiple innovative ways to create a large funding pool. Okay. Robert.
Well, I think while it's an experiment that I don't know how it plays out in Japan in the long run, I think this idea of figuring out ways to incentivize with super matching funding of international venture in India, I think could be incredibly useful. I think it's just creating money that's available locally without kind of choosing what programs to go for. I think there is expertise that, the hardest expertise is like what programs, what companies to drive. I think that's the difference between a CRO and a drug company is whether you're choosing your targets or someone's choosing your targets for you. And incentivizing that risk is hard. I think you pointed out if you need people to have, there's nothing that incentivizes risk-taking more than I think someone else taking those risks with you and paying you to take those risks specifically. And again, like I said, I'm not exactly sure how it's going to play out in Japan, but 5 years is a very short period of time for something to play out. But if I was going to run an experiment, that would be the experiment I would try and run
So
here.
make Scale Up Health an international conference with enough international investors to look at biotech assets.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I get that.
I think both of them said the same thing. It's different versions of the same thing, which is risk capital. And how you would get to risk capital, I think, in India, given investor sentiments of Indian investors, Indian industrialists, risk-averse issues, heavy government involvement in that, whether through incentivization, direct grants. The way as China has done it, China has thrown a lot of money at the problem. Israel threw a lot of money at its problem, right? When it had the massive influx from East Europe, it didn't use it as a crisis, it made it an opportunity. It put a hell of a lot of money into that, it educated people who came back and created their own, big tech environment. But without money, you can't do it.
You'd say that even in the context of a country which obviously has many priorities on what it needs to fund.
I think India has a lot of money. It's a rich country with poor people in it.
Okay, so create a funding mechanism for government. It's interesting that regulatory harmonization, CDM, none of those came up in the one big idea. I think it seems to be a...
Because that's not a big idea.
Yeah, fine. It's converging around...
No, but I'm all for it. I mean, I think it would make a huge difference.
Right.
But I think if there's not capital, it won't make all the difference you need. I think you need both.
Okay. Did you say one question? Okay, that's a high bar. Okay. But there are at least two hands that I can see, so let's at least do two.
Thank you,
Hi.
Satya, for indulging me. And please keep with this look. You give us hope. So ditch the jacket. It's fine. So I've spent most of my career with two large Swiss pharmaceutical companies, and I've felt a lot of joy as well as frustration in the India journey. And one thing that is common with several innovative companies is that they exist in, or countries, is that the local market, the domestic market, is able to sustain a lot of the innovative drugs, right? Whether it's North America or Western Europe, China, Japan. And India has rewarded generics for the last 20, 30 years. So what is your view, all of you, on the patent ecosystem and the generics market, which could potentially fuel the breakthrough in the biotech frontline?
Any volunteers to take that?
Well, I think you started off as you were looking at India. I mean, China was a primarily generics manufacturing market only like 12 years ago or 13 years ago. It wasn't 30 years ago. So that transition to innovative biotech comes from using some part of that manufacturing infrastructure, which again exists here in Japan, in India in spades, right? I mean, the infrastructure for manufacturing is the largest in the world. So, but what links those pieces, I think, as you pointed out, is a domestic market. And I think it's pretty hard in the absence of a domestic market to incentivize anything but what the domestic market is asking for. Yeah, I was asking people, and this is, I think, only slightly relevant. Does anyone remember what the first billion-dollar drug was in the world? Because I didn't. I had to look it up. It was Tagamet. Yeah, so anti-ulcer drug. And the second is captopril. So those are not like rare drugs for cancers. Those are drugs for lots of people. And there was outrage that was $120 a year for Tagamet. And that's why, in fact, you could argue drug prices are exploding in the U.S. is we had to figure out a way to pay for that, and ended up consumers don't face it, like the insurers face it. But, but it sure has led to a lot of innovation in the U.S. in drugs.
I think we lost. Speaking to your question, just say the patent for don't need to be antagonistic between generic and non-generic innovation. Why should they be antagonistic? They're different things. They're meeting different markets, right? There's risk capital in one. There's no risk capital in the other. And so, and patents in India now are filed. And we file all our patents in India. They're accepted. There's no issues. We have over 100 patents. So I don't see that as a problem. I think it's access to healthcare is a much bigger problem in India than patents. And I think that is patents is a nice thing to keep shouting about, but it's not really. If everybody paid for the cost of the research, then of course the cost would come down of the product. And so it's a very simple economic argument. Then I don't think we should confuse them. That's all.
Getting multiple signals on both more questions and that it's time. I'm going to have to defer to the latter one on that. So thank you very much for the panel. Thank you to all of you for the engagement that you've had with us over the last 1 hour. And I hand it over back to our organizers. Thank you.